Have you ever wondered what absolute ruin sounds like? It is not an explosion or a piercing scream. It is the dead silence inside a glass boardroom when a man who fancied himself a god realizes his lifeline rests with the daughter he branded a failure. They threw me into the dark, forgetting that roots thrive in the blackness. Pour a bourbon, sit down, and let me tell you how I burned my father's kingdom with one phone call. Hello to the wonderful listeners of Daisy Revenge Stories. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us without the funds needed to keep operating and paying our hardworking team. If you find today's story compelling, please consider supporting us with just $1 by scanning the QR code on your screen or clicking the donation link in the description or pinned comment below, so we can continue bringing these tales to life for you. My name is Sydney Diaz. The biting Chicago wind howled violently against the frosted glass panes of my suburban greenhouse, a sharp contrast to the suffocating, damp heat trapped inside with me. It was a freezing Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day where the cold seeped deep into your marrow the second you stepped outside. But inside my sanctuary, the air was thick with the scent of wet peat moss, decaying leaves, and fresh loam. I was wrist-deep in a mound of rich, black soil, carefully separating the fragile root systems of rare variegated seedlings. My hands were caked in mud, dirt packed tightly beneath my fingernails. For me, this dirt was proof of life, of creation, of honest work. For my father, it was a brand of shame. The sudden, harsh buzzing of my cell phone vibrating against the wooden potting bench shattered the quiet rhythm of the afternoon. A bright blue rectangle of light pierced the humid gloom. I wiped a streak of sweat from my forehead with the back of my wrist, leaving a smear of topsoil across my brow, and leaned over to check the screen. It was a text message from Arthur Sterling, my father, a man who cast a long, terrifying shadow over the financial district of LaSalle Street, a titan who viewed everyone in his orbit as either an asset to be leveraged or a liability to be discarded. I tapped the screen with a relatively clean knuckle. The message was brief, entirely devoid of punctuation, and dripping with the absolute contempt he had harbored for me since I chose seeds and soil over spreadsheets and stocks. Do not come to my retirement party. The presence of a dirty gardener will only tarnish this family's reputation. You are a failure. For a fraction of a second, the old me conditioned response flared in my chest. The familiar, pathetic tightening of my throat, the instinctual urge to shrink down, to apologize, to somehow make myself smaller so I would not offend his grand sensibilities. But the tears did not come. Instead, a strange, profound silence settled over my mind. The heavy, suffocating weight I had carried around my neck since childhood suddenly evaporated. I did not break down. I did not scream. I walked slowly over to the deep steel sink at the corner of the greenhouse and turned the brass faucet. The icy water blasted over my hands. I grabbed the coarse pumice soap and began to scrub. I watched the thick, dark mud spiral down the drain, taking the remnants of my desperate need for his approval with it. I looked up at my reflection in the smudged window pane and smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was a cold, hollow, terrifying expression that I did not fully recognize. It was the smile of a woman who had finally been pushed past the point of return. I dried my hands meticulously on a rough towel, picked up my phone, and bypassed my contacts list entirely, dialing a number I knew by heart. It was the direct line to the events manager at the Sapphire Atrium, the most exclusive and outrageously expensive luxury hotel in downtown Chicago. For the past 2 years, I had been scraping together every spare cent I earned. I had sacrificed. I had taken on grueling weekend landscaping jobs, and I had quietly amassed a small fortune of $15,000. I took every penny of that hard-earned money and secretly placed a non-refundable deposit to secure the grand ballroom for my father's retirement gala. It was supposed to be my ultimate peace offering, a grand, undeniably lavish gesture to finally prove to the great Arthur Sterling that his failure of a daughter could provide something worthy of his elite world. The line clicked open. The Sapphire Atrium, this is Marcus speaking. How may I assist you? Marcus, this is Sydney Diaz. I am the primary account holder and the sole financial guarantor for the Sterling Retirement Gala scheduled for this upcoming Thursday. Ah, yes, Miss Diaz. We are putting the final touches on the ice sculptures as we speak. Everything is perfectly on track. Cancel it, I said, my voice eerily calm, smooth as glass. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I am sorry, Miss Diaz. I must have misheard you. Did you say cancel? The event is exactly 48 hours away. You heard me perfectly. Marcus, cancel the catering. Cancel the string quartet. Shut down the premium open bar. I want the entire grand ballroom locked. Miss Diaz, you realize that at this late stage, you will forfeit the entirety of your $15,000 deposit? I do not care about the money, I replied, staring blankly at the rows of green plants. I have one very specific instruction. Marcus, and I need you to listen to me very carefully. I want Arthur Sterling's name completely scrubbed from your property. Take his name off the digital marquees in the lobby. Remove the brass welcome placards, if he or his guests arrive. I want your front desk to look them dead in the eye and tell them there is no event booked under that name. Do you understand me? Yes, Miss Diaz. Consider it done. I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the dirt-covered table. It landed with a dull thud. For 32 years, I had been bound by an invisible, choking chain of familial obligation and desperate longing for a father who despised me. With one phone call, I had just snapped it in half. I took a deep breath of the damp, earthy air, feeling lighter than I had in my entire life. The war had just begun, and they had no idea who they had just handed the matches to. To fully grasp the magnitude of what I had done by picking up that phone, you have to understand the absolute darkness of the ecosystem I was born into. My parents, Arthur and Beatrice Sterling, were not merely wealthy. They belonged to a terrifying echelon of the American elite who genuinely believed their net worth elevated them to the status of minor deities. They did not measure human value in kindness, integrity, or character. They measured it exclusively in offshore tax havens, quarterly profit margins, and strategic alliances with other billionaires. To my parents, a person was never a human being with a soul. A person was either an asset to be leveraged for social capital or a liability to be swiftly liquidated. Their marriage itself was nothing more than a calculated corporate merger, and our childhood home was a sprawling, sterile museum designed solely to intimidate guests rather than offer warmth to a family. Love was not a right in the Sterling household. It was a heavily taxed commodity, dispensed in tiny calculated increments only to those who produced the highest return on investment. That highest return always belonged to my older sister, Vanessa. She was the undisputed golden girl of the Sterling Empire, the perfect manifestation of my parents' darkest ambitions. Vanessa was a senior strategic consultant at a predatory management firm, a woman who seemed to bleed corporate jargon and exhale pure ice. She functioned like a flawless, highly calibrated machine wrapped head to toe in custom Chanel tweed. My parents worshipped the very ground her designer heels walked upon. They would parade her around their elite charity galas like a prized thoroughbred, loudly bragging to anyone who would listen about her six-figure quarterly bonuses and the efficient, bloodless way she routinely gutted struggling companies for maximum profit. Vanessa never looked at me as a sister. When she bothered to acknowledge my existence at all, she looked at me the exact same way she looked at the waitstaff pouring her vintage champagne, a minor, somewhat repulsive inconvenience cluttering her line of sight. When I firmly rejected the sacred family path of high finance to pursue a degree in ecological landscape architecture, I might as well have committed high treason against the crown. I wanted to build sustainable, living ecosystems. I wanted to work with the earth, to create spaces that breathed and thrived in harmony with nature. To Arthur and Beatrice, I had deliberately chosen to become a peasant. They openly and mockingly referred to me as the hired help. They told their country club friends I was going through an embarrassing, extended rebellious phase that I would eventually snap out of. In their rigid worldview, digging in the soil was manual labor reserved for those who could not afford to pay someone else to do it. I was a stain on their pristine canvas. The financial gap between Vanessa and me was vast, but the emotional chasm was infinitely wider and far more painful. Then came Leo, my husband. Leo was a dedicated history teacher in the underfunded public high school system. He was a man of profound warmth, endless patience, and unshakable sincerity. He spent his exhausting days trying to inspire apathetic teenagers in overcrowded, sweltering classrooms, earning a painfully modest salary. He came home every evening smelling of chalk dust and cheap coffee, exhausted but deeply fulfilled by his purpose. Leo was my anchor. He was the one pure, decent reality in my life that the Sterling family toxicity had not managed to poison. But to my parents and sister, Leo was the ultimate running punchline. Bringing a public school teacher to a Sterling family Thanksgiving was like dragging a stray, muddy dog into a five-star restaurant. Every single holiday, every forced family dinner was an exhausting exercise in psychological warfare. They rarely attacked Leo directly with vulgar insults. They utilized a much more insidious weapon, weaponized condescension. They would ask him how the little schoolhouse was faring, their voices dripping with a suffocating fake pity. They would loudly discuss purchasing million-dollar vacation homes in Aspen while staring pointedly at his frayed 5-year-old sport coat. Leo bore the brunt of it all with a gentle, stoic smile, silently squeezing my hand under the heavy mahogany table, letting me know he could handle the abuse because he loved me. But the absolute breaking point, the singular moment the fragile illusion of family permanently shattered into a million irreparable pieces, happened at a formal dinner just 3 months ago. We had deliberately parked Leo's 10-year-old, slightly rusted sedan at the very end of their circular driveway, trying desperately to keep it hidden behind a row of manicured hedges. We were seated around the grand dining table, the air thick with tension, when Vanessa took a painfully slow sip of her imported red wine, her sharp eyes locked onto Leo like a predator spotting a wounded animal. "So, Leo," Vanessa purred, raising her voice just enough to ensure the entire table fell dead silent to listen. "I saw that rusted metallic eyesore parked down by the main gate. Are you seriously still driving that rolling death trap? You really should be more careful. If that thing breaks down on the interstate, the city sanitation department might just mistake it for abandoned scrap metal and haul it away to the dump." A chorus of polite, immensely cruel chuckles rippled around the table. I felt a boiling heat rise violently in my cheeks, my mouth opening to tear into her, but Arthur beat me to the punch. My father calmly reached into the breast pocket of his bespoke tailored suit, pulled out his heavy gold money clip, and peeled off a crisp $20 bill. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed it across the expansive table. The green paper fluttered in the air for an agonizing but slow-motion second before landing squarely on Leo's fine china dinner plate, resting right on top of his untouched steak. "Here, son," Arthur sneered, his voice loud and booming, echoing off the vaulted dining room ceiling. "Put that towards a cab ride back to your apartment. I simply cannot have my wealthy neighbors looking out their windows and thinking my daughter married a homeless panhandler." The dining room erupted into genuine, roaring laughter. Even my mother delicately covered her mouth with her linen napkin, her eyes crinkling in obvious amusement. I snapped my head to look at Leo. He did not say a single word. He did not flinch. He just carefully picked up the $20 bill, placed it neatly beside his crystal water glass, and looked down at his lap in deafening silence. The raw humiliation radiating from him physically burned my skin. In that excruciating, frozen second, staring at that piece of currency on the pristine white tablecloth, absolute clarity washed over my mind like ice water. I had endured decades of their mockery, their emotional starvation, and their relentless cruelty because some naive, pathetic part of me believed that if I just absorbed enough of the abuse, eventually they would see my loyalty. Eventually, they would love me. But staring at my husband, the kindest and most honorable man I had ever known, sitting there as the helpless target of their grotesque arrogance, I realized the horrifying truth. My endless endurance was never going to earn their love. It was just providing them with a convenient human shield to protect their monstrous egos. We were not family to them. We were just their favorite form of entertainment. And I decided right then, staring at that $20 bill, that I would leave them with nothing but ashes. Thursday night arrived, carrying with it a bitter, unforgiving chill that swept violently off the dark waters of Lake Michigan. The wind rattled the thin, poorly insulated windows of our cramped, second-story apartment, whistling through the cracks like a chorus of ghosts. While the financial elite of the city were supposedly gathering downtown to celebrate a titan, Leo and I were surrounded by battered cardboard boxes, rolls of clear packing tape, and overstuffed canvas duffel bags. The worn hardwood floor was entirely covered in the scattered remnants of our modest life. I stood by the edge of our small bed, folding my thickest wool winter sweaters and pressing them down into the luggage. My hands moved with a steady, methodical, and incredibly calm rhythm. There was absolutely no hesitation in my chest. The heavy, suffocating dread that usually accompanied any major event involving my toxic family was completely eradicated, replaced instead by a thrilling, high-octane surge of pure, unadulterated adrenaline. We were finally leaving. We were walking away from the towering shadows, the endless insults, and the suffocating gravity of the Sterling family empire. From across the narrow living room, my cell phone suddenly began to vibrate violently against the cheap Formica surface of the kitchen counter. It danced erratically across the laminate, emitting a frantic, continuous buzzing sound that demanded immediate attention. I intentionally ignored the first 3 incoming calls, letting the digital rings echo in the empty apartment. By the 4th consecutive call, I knew the detonation had successfully occurred downtown. I walked slowly over to the counter, picked up the glowing device, and stared at the bright screen. It was my cousin, Clara, a wealthy, superficial woman who lived entirely for high society gossip and thrived immensely on the sudden misfortune of others. I swiped my thumb across the glass to accept the call and firmly pressed the speaker icon, placing the phone gently back on the counter so Leo could hear the catastrophic fallout while he carefully taped up a heavy box of history books. "Sydney, are you completely out of your mind?" Clara shrieked through the tiny, metallic speaker. Her voice was trembling wildly, carrying a chaotic, breathless mixture of absolute panic and undeniable, thrilling excitement. "Where on earth are you? It is an absolute, unprecedented disaster down here, a complete and unmitigated catastrophe." I leaned casually against the edge of the kitchen sink, crossing my arms defensively over my chest. "Tell me exactly what is happening. Clara, do not spare a single detail." The story poured out of her in a frantic, hurried rush, painting a brilliant masterpiece of public humiliation that I could visualize with absolute, crystal clarity. Exactly 45 minutes prior, my father had arrived at the sweeping grand entrance of the Sapphire Atrium. He stepped out of the back of a sleek, black, chauffeur-driven town car, wearing a custom-tailored $10,000 Tom Ford tuxedo, looking every inch the invincible, conquering titan of finance he believed himself to be. He was flanked closely by my mother, draped heavily in blinding diamonds, and Vanessa, wearing her usual severe, intimidating haute couture. Trailing right behind them like loyal subjects was a veritable army of VIP investors, high-profile hedge fund managers, and a massive swarm of local financial journalists invited specifically to document the grand crowning achievement of his long career. Arthur marched arrogantly through the revolving glass doors, fully expecting to see a rolling red carpet, glowing digital marquees flashing his name, and the fawning, terrified attention of the luxury hotel staff. Instead, he was immediately and abruptly intercepted by a solid, immovable wall of broad-shouldered security guards, standing firmly at the base of the grand marble sweeping staircase. The head of hotel security politely but loudly informed my father that he could not proceed to the upper luxury levels. Arthur, naturally, lost his famous temper instantly. Clara vividly described how the skin on his face turned a dangerous, mottled shade of crimson. He began shouting violently, demanding aggressively to see the general manager, and loudly threatening to buy the entire hotel property tomorrow morning, just to fire every single employee standing in his way. The massive commotion echoed loudly through the cavernous, gold-leafed lobby, instantly drawing the shocked stares of every wealthy patron present and the eager, flashing camera lenses of the financial press. Then, Marcus, the impeccably dressed events manager I had spoken to exactly 2 days prior, calmly descended the marble stairs. He held a leather-bound digital tablet and maintained an expression of absolute terrifying professional calm. "Mr. Sterling," Marcus said, his clear voice carrying perfectly over my father's furious, echoing shouting, "There is no corporate event booked under your name at this establishment tonight, or any other night." "Do you have any idea who I am?" Arthur roared, literal spittle flying from his trembling lips, as the wealthy investors standing behind him began to murmur in growing confusion. "I have the grand luxury ballroom reserved for 300 elite guests. You are looking at a multi-million-dollar corporate lawsuit, you incompetent fool." "Sir, I assure you with absolute certainty, there is no error," Marcus replied flawlessly, pulling up the digital ledger file on his screen. The grand ballroom was indeed reserved for a retirement gala this evening. However, the sole financial guarantor for that specific space, a Miss Sydney Diaz, explicitly and permanently canceled the entire reservation exactly 48 hours ago. She also left very strict, undeniable instructions that your name was to be barred from all our digital hotel registries, because she was the only individual who actually paid the $15,000 financial deposit. The room legally belonged to her to cancel. Now, sir, I must ask you and your unauthorized party to vacate our private lobby immediately, or I will be forced to contact the Chicago Police Department to have you physically escorted out for trespassing and aggressively disturbing the peace." Clara actually gasped for breath as she recounted the sheer, paralyzing, dead silence that instantly fell over the massive hotel lobby. The journalists immediately began typing furiously on their mobile phones, capturing the unbelievable scandal. The VIP investors, ruthless men who smelled weakness like blood in the water, began slowly backing away toward the exit, their faces twisting in deep, secondhand embarrassment. Arthur Sterling, the historically untouchable god of LaSalle Street, had been publicly and brutally castrated, turned away from a luxury hotel like a common vagrant, and threatened with police action in front of his most crucial business allies. The unassailable, pristine reputation he had spent 40 years building with ruthless precision was permanently stained, transformed in a matter of excruciating seconds into a pathetic, public laughingstock. "They are leaving right now," Clara whispered loudly, the chaotic background noise on the phone confirming her frantic words. "Your father looks like he's going to have a massive heart attack right on the sidewalk." Vanessa is desperately trying to hide her face from the flashing cameras with her designer handbag. "Sydney, they are going to absolutely kill you." "They have to find me first," I replied softly, my voice completely devoid of any fear. I reached out and immediately ended the call. I did not wait another single second. I forcefully popped the back plastic cover off my cell phone, pulled out the tiny plastic data card, and snapped it cleanly in half with my thumbnail. I dropped the broken pieces directly into the kitchen trash can. Leo stood quietly in the apartment doorway, a heavy canvas duffel bag slung effortlessly over his broad, strong shoulder. A slow, incredibly warm, and deeply reassuring smile spread across his handsome face. "Are you ready, Mrs. Diaz?" he asked, his voice steady, deep, and beautifully grounding. "More than ready," I answered, grabbing my heavy winter coat. We walked out of that freezing apartment and never looked back once. We loaded the very last of our cardboard boxes into the rusty trunk of Leo's battered sedan. The old engine sputtered slightly in protest before finally roaring to life, creating a beautiful, defiant sound in the freezing, dead night air. We pulled out of the narrow, icy alleyway and merged seamlessly onto the southbound interstate highway. Far behind us, the glittering, towering skyline of Chicago slowly faded into the pitch-black darkness, taking the smoldering ruins of my father's massive legacy with it. Directly ahead of us lay the endless, dark stretch of open highway, leading straight down to Austin, Texas. We were completely untraceable ghosts, leaving absolutely no forwarding address, zero financial trails, and absolutely zero explanations. The heavy chains were completely broken, and our brand new, beautiful life had just officially begun. 3 years evaporated in the blistering golden heat of the Texas sun. Austin was not just a geographic relocation, it was an entirely different universe, a fertile ground where my roots finally found the boundless space to plunge deep and anchor themselves. In the span of 36 months, the dirt I once scrubbed from my fingernails had transformed into an untouchable empire. I proudly founded Verdant Horizon Innovations, an exclusive ecological landscape architecture firm catering strictly to the ultra-wealthy. I did not design mere backyards. I engineered massive, self-sustaining, multi-million-dollar biospheres for the reclusive tech billionaires flooding the state. My clients were the brilliant architects of the digital age, men and women possessing infinite capital who desperately craved a tangible connection to the earth. I gave them private, breathing sanctuaries. The wealth I steadily accumulated was staggering, a silent tide of financial prosperity that easily rivaled the inherited fortunes of the elite circles I had permanently abandoned. Yet, unlike the boastful existence of my past, my life remained entirely private. Leo and I lived in a breathtaking architectural masterpiece hidden behind towering groves of ancient oak trees, utterly invisible to the prying eyes of the world. We had won. The war was supposedly over. But the universe possesses a profoundly poetic and ruthless sense of justice. While my kingdom bloomed vibrantly in the southern heat, a catastrophic winter was violently tearing through my father's world. The glorious news broke on a quiet Tuesday morning. I was sipping green tea on my expansive cedar deck when the urgent notification flashed across my digital tablet. It was not a minor financial stumble. It was a complete, earth-shattering annihilation. The Federal Securities and Exchange Commission had aggressively raided the towering LaSalle Street headquarters of Arthur Sterling's investment fund. Every major news network flashed his disgraced face across the screen. Swarms of federal agents had shattered the grand illusion, physically hauling out massive towers of encrypted hard drives and heavy boxes filled with forged documents. The great, untouchable financial titan had not been generating legitimate wealth. He had been orchestrating a colossal, devastating Ponzi scheme spanning over 2 entire decades. He had systematically defrauded public pension funds, charitable organizations, and his own wealthy peers just to fund his opulent manufactured reality. The collateral damage from the raid was absolute and magnificent to witness. Vanessa, the flawless golden girl of the family, was inextricably implicated in the massive fraud. Her elegant signature was plastered all over the fraudulent financial disclosures. The ruthless consulting firm she worshipped unceremoniously terminated her employment within 2 hours of the raid. State regulatory boards moved with terrifying speed, permanently stripping away all of her prestigious licenses. Within 6 weeks, my sister was violently forced to file for complete bankruptcy. The irony was intoxicating. The woman who evaluated everyone by their net worth now possessed a net worth of absolute zero. Her custom wardrobe, priceless jewelry, and luxurious downtown high-rise apartment were brutally liquidated by federal courts to pay off insurmountable legal debts. As for Arthur, he was staring straight down the barrel of a potential 20-year federal prison sentence and the total seizure of every single asset he owned. His sprawling mansions were locked down. His offshore accounts were frozen solid, and his fleet of luxury vehicles was swiftly impounded. The high society friends who used to drink his expensive champagne and laugh cruelly at my husband scattered immediately. They vanished into the shadows, terrified that his radioactive legal status would contaminate their carefully curated reputations. However, a dying predator is always at its absolute most dangerous when completely backed into a corner. Arthur had one final desperate card left to play. Through an underground network of elite real estate brokers, I retained to secure massive land acquisitions. A very interesting rumor crossed my mahogany desk. My father possessed a single, deeply hidden physical asset that miraculously escaped the initial federal freeze. It was a massive, historic vineyard estate, located right on the rugged outskirts of the Texas Hill Country, purchased several decades ago under a complex labyrinth of anonymous holding companies. He was in a state of sheer panic. He was no longer the arrogant god of LaSalle Street. He was a terrified fugitive clinging to a single, fading hope. He needed untraceable liquid cash immediately, presumably to secure defense attorneys or to fund an illegal flight out of the country before his passport was revoked. He was desperately hunting for a phantom, an anonymous billionaire willing to execute a blind off-market cash purchase to quietly liquidate the property before the government realized it existed. I sat alone in my spacious executive office, looking out over the vibrant green canopy of my private estate, and felt a cold, brilliant strategy formulate in my mind. I instructed my lead legal counsel to establish a brand new, deeply layered corporate shell company based entirely overseas, completely masking any possible connection to my real name. Through this untraceable entity, I reached out into the dark and extended a golden lifeline to the drowning king. I instructed my broker to submit an aggressive, all-cash offer to purchase the entire vineyard. The deadly trap was meticulously set, the heavy steel jaws pulled wide open, waiting patiently for the desperate prey to step right in. The summit was chosen with brutal, calculated precision. I secured the grand boardroom of a sprawling, ultra-modern legal fortress occupying the entire 60th floor of the most imposing skyscraper in downtown Austin. It was a space designed exclusively to intimidate. The walls were constructed of massive, floor-to-ceiling acoustic glass panes that offered a sweeping, godlike view of the sprawling Texas Capitol, completely isolating the room from the noise of the city below. The air conditioning was intentionally cranked down to a freezing temperature, a subtle psychological tactic designed to make the desperate feel even more exposed and vulnerable. The vast room was dominated by a 50-foot table carved from a single slab of polished black obsidian, reflecting the harsh, sterile overhead lights like a dark mirror. From the absolute safety of an adjacent private office, I stood behind a panel of one-way glass and watched my father be escorted into the room. The visual evidence of his spectacular downfall was staggering. This was a man who used to charter private jets to fly to Europe for a simple weekend dinner. Today, he had arrived on a deeply discounted budget airline, crammed agonizingly into a middle seat in the rear economy section. He looked terribly aged, a hollow, rapidly decaying shell of his former terrifying glory. His skin, once bronzed by expensive tropical vacations, was now a sallow, sickly gray. He wore a once expensive tailored suit that now hung loosely and pathetically on his dramatically thinned frame. The fabric was deeply wrinkled, smelling faintly of stale airplane cabin air and sheer, unadulterated panic. He clutched a battered leather briefcase tightly to his chest, his knuckles completely white, holding onto the worn leather as if it were a physical life preserver in a violently churning ocean. He sat alone at the far end of the massive obsidian table, looking incredibly small and insignificant. I watched his hands violently tremble. He kept wiping his sweaty palms aggressively against his slacks, his sunken eyes darting frantically toward the heavy oak door every time he heard a faint sound in the hallway. He was clinging entirely to the fabricated illusion of my foreign holding company. He was desperately, fervently praying that the anonymous overseas tycoon walking through that door would blindly hand over the millions in liquid cash he needed to successfully bribe his way out of a massive federal indictment. The tension inside the glass room was a physical, heavy weight, thick and suffocating. He poured himself a glass of water from the heavy crystal pitcher resting on the table, but his hands shook so violently that the ice clattered loudly against the glass, spilling a large puddle of water onto the polished dark stone. He hastily tried to wipe it up with his sleeve. entirely stripping away whatever dignity he had left. At exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the heavy brass handle of the boardroom door turned with a solid, definitive click. The sound echoed through the silent room like a gunshot. I did not rush. I stepped into the freezing boardroom with the measured, predatory grace of someone who owned the very air circulating inside it. I wore a masterfully tailored, midnight blue designer suit that cut a sharp, unforgiving silhouette. The heavy, solid gold weight of a highly exclusive, limited edition Rolex gleamed coldly on my left wrist, a subtle but undeniable declaration of absolute, insurmountable wealth. The sharp, rhythmic clicking of my designer stilettos against the Italian marble floor echoed loudly, sounding exactly like a judge's heavy gavel falling in a dead-silent courtroom. Arthur scrambled frantically to his feet. A pathetic, trembling, incredibly desperate smile was plastered tightly across his face, a mask of pure subservience ready to grovel to the foreign billionaire who held his ultimate survival. Then, his bloodshot eyes locked onto my face. The fake, desperate smile instantly shattered. It was replaced by a look of sheer, incomprehensible horror. All the color violently drained from his face, leaving him looking like a fresh corpse. The muscles in his jaw slackened completely, his mouth falling open in a silent, agonizing gasp. The battered leather briefcase slipped entirely from his numb, frozen fingers. It crashed loudly against the hard floor, the metal clasps snapping open, spilling useless papers across the marble. He physically stopped breathing. I could practically see the violent gears grinding and breaking in his mind as profound cognitive dissonance threatened to tear his sanity completely apart. He was being forced to process the mind-bending realization that the invisible, almighty titan holding his physical freedom, the singular entity standing between him and a small concrete cage, was the dirty gardener he had so ruthlessly and publicly thrown away. I did not smile. I offered absolutely zero warmth, zero gloating, and zero mercy. My face was a perfectly carved mask of solid ice. I walked slowly and deliberately past him, moving to the absolute head of the long table, the ultimate seat of power and authority. I sat down in the high-backed leather chair. I opened my sleek leather portfolio and slowly withdrew the thick, 80-page acquisition contract. I placed it squarely in the exact center of the black table with a dull, heavy thud. I leaned back into the plush leather, folded my hands flawlessly over the documents, and stared directly into his terrified, unblinking eyes. I did not speak a single word, intentionally letting the crushing, suffocating silence stretch on for agonizing minutes, brutally forcing Arthur Sterling to face the absolute, undeniable reality of his own pathetic ruin. The silence stretched until the sheer weight of it seemed to physically crush him. Arthur's knees buckled. The man who had once demanded unquestioning obedience from entire boardrooms collapsed into the plush leather chair opposite me, burying his face in his trembling, liver-spotted hands. And then, a sound I never thought I would hear in my lifetime echoed through the freezing room. Arthur Sterling began to sob. It was not a dignified, but quiet grief. It was a wet, wretched, agonizing wail of a broken creature who finally understood he was entirely out of options. "Sydney, please," he choked out, his voice utterly destroyed, snot and tears smearing across his ashen face. He threw away the last shred of his legendary pride, leaning heavily across the dark table, his hands reaching out as if to grasp mine. I pulled back slightly, repulsed by the gesture. "You have to help me. I am your father. We are blood. We are family. You cannot let them lock me away in a concrete cell. Your mother is scrubbing toilets at a roadside motel right now just so we can buy groceries. Vanessa is living in a homeless shelter. We have lost everything. Please, you have to save us. Blood is thicker than water." I stared at him. Not a single muscle in my face moved. I let him cry for another long, humiliating minute before I leaned forward, my voice cutting through his pathetic sobbing like a freshly sharpened razor. "Family," I whispered, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. "Blood, that is a fascinating choice of vocabulary coming from you. Arthur, let me tell you what family meant to you. Family was tossing a $20 bill onto my husband's dinner plate because his honest life offended your aristocratic sensibilities. Family was forcing us to park a rusted car out of sight so your billionaire friends would not realize you were related to a public servant. Family was sending me a text message calling me a failure and a dirty gardener just 48 hours before a grand celebration I bought with the sweat off my own back. You never cared about blood. You only ever cared about leverage. He flinched violently at every word, shrinking back into his chair as if I were physically striking him. You did not come here looking for a daughter, I continued, my tone dropping to a dead, absolute calm. You came here looking for an anonymous foreign investor to bail you out of a 20-year federal prison sentence, and I am going to do exactly that. But we are going to do this my way. I slid the thick contract across the black obsidian stone. I uncapped a heavy gold fountain pen and placed it gently on top of the signature page. I will purchase the vineyard, I stated clearly, but I will not give you the $50 million it is actually worth. I am buying it for exactly 10% of its market value. Arthur gasped, his bloodshot eyes widening in absolute horror. 10%? Sydney, you cannot do that. That is barely enough to pay off the federal prosecutors and the minimum restitution fees. I will have absolutely nothing left. I will be penniless. I will have to live on the streets for the rest of my life. That is precisely the point, I replied, leaning back in my chair, unblinking. 10% keeps you out of a federal penitentiary. It gives you your physical freedom, but it guarantees that you, Beatrice and Vanessa, will spend every single day of the rest of your natural lives experiencing the exact same financial terror and exhaustion you mocked Leo and me for enduring. You will count pennies at the grocery store. You will ride the public bus. You will be the peasants you always despised. He stared at the contract, his entire body convulsing with suppressed sobs. He looked at me, searching desperately for a flicker of mercy, a hint of the desperate daughter who used to crave his validation. He found nothing but a vast, frozen wasteland. He was looking at a predator of his own creation. Sign the paper, Arthur, I commanded softly, or walk out that door right now. Go back to Chicago and turn yourself in to the federal marshals. The fight drained out of him completely. With a shaking, devastated hand, he picked up the gold pen. I watched as tears fell freely from his cheeks, splashing onto the crisp white paper, blurring the dark blue ink as he slowly signed away his final asset, his legacy, and his entire future. The great Arthur Sterling was officially dead. When he finally set the pen down, he looked like a hollowed-out ghost. I picked up the signed document, placed it neatly back into my leather portfolio, and pressed a small silver button hidden beneath the table. Immediately, the heavy boardroom door swung open. Two massive, suited security guards stepped into the room. "Mr. Sterling is finished here," I told the guards, my voice completely devoid of emotion. I looked back at the shattered man one final time. "You are never to contact me again. If you, my mother, or my sister ever attempt to approach me, my home, or my business, I will personally ensure the federal government looks into the offshore accounts you hid back in the 90s. Escort him out." I did not watch him leave. I turned my chair to face the massive glass window, looking out over the sprawling, sunlit city of Austin as the heavy door clicked shut behind him, sealing his fate forever. An hour later, I drove my car up the winding, private gravel driveway of my estate. The afternoon sun cast a warm golden glow over the dense canopy of ancient oaks and the vibrant, thriving gardens I had cultivated with my own hands. As I parked and stepped out into the fragrant air, I saw Leo. He was kneeling on the lush green grass of our sprawling front lawn, laughing freely and loudly as he played a game of fetch with our newly rescued golden retriever. The dog barked happily, bounding across the yard under the clear blue Texas sky. I stood there for a long moment, simply watching the man I loved. A profound, overwhelming sense of peace washed over my entire being. I finally understood the ultimate truth. The most perfect, devastating revenge was not about destroying the people who hurt you. It was about surviving the fire, planting your roots deep into the earth, and building a brilliant, incredibly beautiful life that those toxic people would never, ever have the privilege of stepping foot inside. The war was over, I had won, and my garden was finally in full bloom. Thank you so much to all the wonderful listeners of Daisy Revenge Stories for staying with me through this entire journey. I would love to know where you are listening to this story from, so please let me know in the comments. If you found today's story engaging and satisfying, please consider helping us out. With YouTube entirely removing our monetization, a small donation of just $1 makes a massive difference. You can support our hardworking team and help them provide for their families by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the donation link in the description or the pinned comment. Your kindness allows us to keep creating and bringing these powerful stories to life for you.